Good evening, students. We are on to our third section of World War I, a global conflict. Our essential question for tonight is, how did World War I become a global conflict, and how did the governments involved meet the demands of the conflict? I would like you to please take focus notes in your composition book. Focus on where the war spread and how each country mobilized its resources at home. Include all the words that are in bold. And please summarize your notes to include the essential question at the end. All right, thank you very much, and I look forward to discussing with you tomorrow. As we pick up the war, we see that Western Europe was a bloody stalemate, and the Eastern Front, Russia and Germany, Russia was not faring very well. So the Allies felt that they needed to figure out a way to break the stalemate and somehow help Russia. They saw this through a strait that connected the Mediterranean Sea to the Black Sea called the Dardanelles. What this would do was it would open up a supply line to the backside of the Russian line where the Russians could actually get guns and ammunition to their soldiers, where they could actually be formidable against the Germans. It would also cut the Ottoman Empire off from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, isolating the Ottomans, and hopefully isolating the Austro-Hungarians as well. So this would be the major focus of the warfare. Now, England being such a massive empire, this would be the first time where we would see what we would call Commonwealth troops or Commonwealth forces coming into the fighting, specifically Australians and Kiwis. Now, the battle would begin in February 1915. However, like much else, the Central Powers were able to match the Allied firepower, and they were able to defend their highly fortified positions, and it quickly ground to another stalemate, with neither side being able to really move. In the Allied circles, this would be regarded as a major failure, and this would lead to British High Command kicking First Lord of the Admiralty, which is like the Secretary of the Navy in the United States, Winston Churchill, out of his position and forcing him to join the infantry in northern France. Well, this is regarded as a major failure for Winston Churchill. Eventually, this would lead him to becoming the Prime Minister of England and also one of the most important figures in 20th century history. With the help of the Germans, the Ottomans would be able to hold off Allied forces and secure the area of Gallipoli for the Central Powers, and essentially end the idea that there would be a second front that would help the Russians. While this benefited the Ottomans for the time being, this particular failure would eventually doom the Russians. As we discussed in our imperialism unit, most European countries took little slices of China to benefit their empires. Well, this would be Japan's time to shine. Japan, as fighting for the Allies, would attack and take over German holdings in China and in and around the Pacific Islands. They sought the approval of their European counterparts. They wanted to be looked at as all other European imperial forces, and that being able to be capable of taking and creating their own empire. But this would form the beginnings of what we would refer to as Imperial Japan, which would last until 1945. After the Japanese attacks on German colonies, attacks amongst the colonies quickly spread. The English and the French would attack and obtain control of 3 of the 4 German holdings in Africa. Thus, now we have fighting on 3 continents by soldiers from 4 continents, thus making it a true world war. Now, besides the fighting in Africa and in Asia, the vast majority of the fighting would be done on the European continent. but it would be done with soldiers from all over the world. The British and the French would recruit their subjects, or what we call conscript, meaning force them into military service, subjects from within their colonies to either participate as soldiers or workers to supply the front lines. They would ship them from their colonial holdings all the way to northern France. With the fear of being outgunned, the Germans would start one of their most deadly policies of the war. This is what we would refer to as unrestricted submarine warfare. Now, submarine was a pretty new invention at the time. In fact, we will call them German U-boats. U-boat stands for Unterseeboot, which literally translates to under the sea boat. And basically what this was set up to do was that the Germans would sink any ship without warning in and around British waters. They did not make any sort of calculation of if it was a military boat or a civilian vessel. The idea was to keep America from doing any significant trade with the British to provide the British with supplies. They felt like they could choke off England from getting supplies, thus end their ability to fight in the war. So despite sound logic behind what we would refer to as a blockade and their attempt to stop trade with England, this would have disastrous effects for the Germans. And this came when the Germans sunk a ocean liner called the Lusitania. Now the problem with this was, although it was carrying war supplies for the British front, there was also 128 U.S. citizens that were sailing aboard, and all 128 U.S. citizens died within the sinking of the Lusitania. And this gave the United States government a desire to get into the war on behalf of the British and the French. They would just need one more little nudge before the United States would also declare war on the Germans. That nudge would come with what is known as the infamous Zimmermann telegram. And what the Zimmermann telegram was a telegram sent by one of the German foreign ministers to the Mexican consulate. And what this telegram said is that the Germans would help Mexico reconquer the land that they had lost to the United States in the Mexican-American War if Mexico would help launch attacks against the United States. In essence, it was encouraging Mexico to start a war with the United States to keep the United States out of the European war. What happened, though, was Mexico did not start a war with the United States, and this gave the United States all the need it wanted to get into the fight in Europe. Now, the United States would devote all of its resources to the creation of the war effort. At the time, the United States did not have a huge military. And so what they did is they essentially conscripted all of the industry in the United States to turn over to the military, basically to build military goods. And this is something that we would call total war. Total war is when a country devotes all of their resources to the war effort. Governments would tell factories what to produce and how much to produce. They would no longer build civilian goods, they would build military goods. So instead of a car factory, now we would have a tank factory. Instead of building civilian sea vessels, we would now see shipbuilders building battleships, and etc. The positive part about this is that the countries that would be fighting would have 0% unemployment. In order to make this happen, everybody would have to be involved. And for everybody to be involved, people could no longer consume all of the goods that they once consumed. And so therefore, the people at home would go on what we would call rations. Rationing is the process in which people could only buy small amounts of those items that were also needed for the war effort. So we would see rations of beef. We would see rations of leather because that leather was needed for shoes. We would see rations of wool. Wool be needed for uniforms. We would see rations of rubber because rubber was needed for truck tires in the war. So everybody would have to limit their intake of goods at home so the soldiers could use them in war. So how do you get people on board with basically limiting their usage of things and luxuries that they enjoy? You do it through propaganda. You get people to believe in your cause. Now, what propaganda is a one-sided information designed to persuade and keep the morale and support the war. The propaganda would influence people to sign up for the war based on their nationalist ideals. And they would do this by demonizing the other side. As we can see in this particular picture, they're depicting the Germans as these evil, sort of ape-like creatures that will decimate our women and destroy our society. In later years, nationalism would return to resentment by the soldiers, many of them who were conscripted, meaning forced to fight, and these soldiers would not be very happy about it. Now, with many of the able-bodied men out at the front, women would have to replace them in the factories, offices, and shops. And this would be a time where women were sort of bridging a gap. We were coming out of the Victorian age, where women were really thought of still as property, and they were being able to be put into the public arena. That is no accident that in 1918, the year the war ends, women are given the right to vote, because women were essentially showed themselves as not just being delicate little flowers, but being people of consequence and being people that are worthy of fighting. Women's most important contribution to the war effort was in the field of nursing. This was also the field where people saw the actual value of women on the battlefield, in essence, showing that they were worthy of a position at the table. They did this through aiding doctors in surgery, oftentimes without any sort of anesthesia, holding men down, administering medicine, performing triage on soldiers, and basically performing very, very difficult tasks that many men were certainly not up to. All right, well, thank you again for a wonderful lecture, and please summarize your notes and be prepared to discuss propaganda tomorrow. Thank you very much, and see you in the morning.